In a conference room as cold as a courtroom, Aiden Brooks stood silently beside his old laptop, the back of his hand still marked with a crayon streak his daughter had left there that morning. Before him, the board of directors at Northstar Logic was searching for someone to blame in a lawsuit worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Mason Keller laughed and called him a charity hire, a man taken on out of pity. But when every piece of official evidence had vanished, Aiden opened an email he had saved 8 years before, and the room went silent. Follow this story to the end, because one forgotten email was about to change the fate of an entire company. The morning had started like any other at Northstar Logic, which made the weight of it harder to bear. The company occupied 4 polished floors in downtown Cincinnati, all floor-to-ceiling glass and steel frame furniture that telegraphed confidence to anyone who walked through the lobby. The display screens in the atrium had always cycled through product demos, client logos, and quarterly growth charts. But that Monday, every screen in the building had been switched over to a single live news feed. The crawl at the bottom repeated the same phrase every 30 seconds. Brightline data files sued against Northstar Logic, estimated damages in excess of $300 million. Northstar Logic was a software company that had built its reputation on predictive logistics technology. Their flagship platform used artificial intelligence to analyze freight routes in real time, anticipating delays before they cascaded into missed deliveries. For years, the company had been a quiet success story, not flashy, not famous, but trusted by some of the largest distribution networks in the country. That trust was now in danger of collapsing in a single week. The lawsuit filed by Brightline Data accused Northstar of stealing the foundation of their most valuable technology, a feature called predictive routing memory, which enabled logistics systems to retain records of past disruptions, closed bridges, overwhelmed warehouses, weather events, labor disputes, and apply that history to future routing decisions. Brightline claimed Northstar had reverse-engineered their private research and built a system indistinguishable from what Brightline had developed. The dollar amount attached to the claim was not an accident. It was designed to terrify. Aiden Brooks did not look like someone who could stop any of that. He was 32 years old, dressed in a button-down shirt that had been washed too many times, carrying a personal laptop in a worn canvas bag that had a small smear of red crayon along the strap. He had been transferred into the company's internal data audit team just 3 months earlier, brought in through a workforce re-entry initiative that Northstar had launched for single parents and returning professionals. Most of the people in the executive conference room on the 14th floor did not know his name. The ones who did know it did not take it seriously. In the conference room, the board had been arguing since 7 in the morning. Mason Keller sat at the head of the table, silver-haired and precise, the kind of man who was always the most expensive presence in any room he entered. He wanted an explanation that could be handed to the press without further questions. Either an admission of procedural failure or the identification of a group to absorb the blame. He spoke about optics and capping exposure. He did not speak about what was actually true. Violet Harrington, the company's 29-year-old CEO, sat across from him, listening with the controlled composure of someone who had learned not to show panic in public. Evelyn Hart, the head of legal, had already informed the board that the company's official document archive only held records from the past 6 years. Brightline's registered filings predated that window. Without evidence that Northstar had conceived the technology first, the company's legal position was nearly indefensible. When Aiden spoke from the far end of the table, his voice was quiet enough that 1 or 2 people had to look up to see who had made the sound. He suggested, carefully, that it might be worth examining early technical email correspondence from the platform's development period. Mason Keller cut him off before he finished the sentence. He asked, in a tone that made several people look away, what a man hired through a single-parent employment program could possibly know about enterprise-level legal documentation. He used the phrase, charity hire, with no hesitation, the way someone uses a word they have used many times before. The room absorbed it without comment. Lucas Grant, the senior engineer, studied the grain of the conference table. Madison Pierce, the head of communications, reached for her phone. Evelyn sat still and gave nothing away. Violet watched Aiden from across the room. She saw his hand tighten around the strap of his bag. Just for a second. He did not respond to Mason. He turned to the nearest window and looked at the news crawl still running silently on the glass below. Then he lowered his eyes to his laptop, as if something had just occurred to him that had not occurred to anyone else. That evening, Aiden's apartment was exactly the kind of place that made the 14th floor conference room feel like a different planet. The kitchen table was a little too small for comfort and covered with things that had no other home. A folder of utility statements clipped together, a library book about horses, a plastic cup of colored markers with no cap on the blue one. The laptop sat at one end, pushed back to make room for dinner, and beside it was an open box of crayons, from which a single red stick was missing. Sophia was 7 years old and already the most perceptive person in most rooms she walked into. She noticed when her father came home with the specific kind of tiredness that was different from the ordinary kind, heavier across the shoulders, quieter than usual. She asked him what had happened at work while he was heating soup on the stove, and he told her that the company was dealing with something complicated. She sat on the counter and watched him stir. After a moment, she asked whether the complicated thing was connected to the news, because she had heard a teacher say something. Aiden said it was. She asked if he was in trouble. He said no, not him personally. They ate together at the small table. Sophia worked through her homework, and Aiden sat across from her, and for a while neither of them said much. Then she looked up and asked if he was an important person at work. The question landed on him in a way he had not expected. He took a moment before he answered. He told her that not every important person sat at the head of the table. Some people were important because they remembered things other people had already forgotten. What the people at North Star did not know about Aiden Brooks was that he had not always been a support technician scraping together work around his daughter's schedule. 8 years earlier, he had worked for a small technical contractor called Control Systems, which had been hired by North Star to assist with early-stage platform testing. At the time, North Star was still growing, still full of engineers trading ideas over email because there was no formal process for anything. Aiden had been young and thorough, the kind of employee who documented everything not because anyone told him to, but because he believed it mattered. When his ex-wife left, he had made a choice that quietly cost him professionally. He stopped taking assignments that required travel, took smaller contracts, and lost momentum. But he had kept his files, a complete archive of his work history, exported legally from Clearwell when the company wound down its contract with North Star, sat on an external drive that had traveled with him through 3 apartments and 2 laptops. After Sophia went to bed, Aiden opened the drive. He typed search terms he had been turning over in his mind all day: routing memory, predictive delay, incident recall layer. For several minutes, nothing of use appeared. Then he found a folder he had not opened in years, labeled with a date from 8 years ago. He did not open the first file he saw. He sat for a moment with his hand on the keyboard, looking toward the closed door of Sophia's room, and breathed slowly. Then he looked back at the screen. The email subject line read, Prototype Logic, Root Memory Layer, Internal Concept Review. 8 years ago, Aiden had been 24 and carrying a second-hand work bag that was not so different from the one he still owned. He had been assigned by Clearwell Systems to provide technical support for North Star's earliest data infrastructure tests. North Star back then had perhaps 40 employees working out of a rented office suite. Nothing about it suggested the company would one day be cited in a $300 million lawsuit. The platform they were building was ambitious and unstable. Engineers sent bug reports in the middle of the night. Product ideas circulated in long email threads before anyone had the budget to build them. Aiden was not the creative force behind any of those ideas. He needed to be clear about that. His role was to receive, categorize, log, and respond to technical issues. He was a conduit, not an inventor. But in that role, he was exceptionally careful. One afternoon, a senior product manager at North Star sent the Clearwell team a document describing a system feature they were considering building into the platform's next iteration. The concept was a memory layer. Instead of optimizing routes only for current conditions, the system would retain a history of disruptions by segment frozen roads, overloaded distribution hubs, recurring accident zones, and apply that accumulated history to future calculations. The document used language that would later be nearly identical to what appeared in the disputed technology at the center of the Brightline lawsuit. Aiden had responded to that email. He had flagged a potential technical issue and offered a small suggestion: that each disruption event be tagged with a code attached to the specific route segment it affected, so the system could weight certain types of failures more heavily based on frequency. The response from one of the North Star product team members had confirmed the suggestion was useful and had been noted. That reply existed in Aiden's archive. It had a timestamp, a server signature, an attached draft document, and a list of recipients that included 2 of North Star's original engineers. The project had never moved forward. Funding was redirected. The team that had been working on it scattered across different assignments. Clearwell's contract with North Star ended, and when it did, the Clearwell manager responsible for project archives had asked Aiden to export the complete support record as part of the formal handover. He had done so. He had kept a personal copy as part of his own professional record, because that was what the handover protocol at Clearwell required. He had not thought about it since. Now, sitting alone in his kitchen at 11 at night, Aiden looked at the email and felt something that was not excitement. It was closer to the sensation of recognizing a face you had not seen in a very long time. The date on the email predated Brightline's filed documentation by nearly a full year. The attached draft was labeled Root Memory Layer. The names on the recipient list were the names of people who had once worked at North Star before they scattered. He made a backup copy immediately, without opening the attachment, without renaming or modifying anything. Then he sent a short message to Violet Harrington's work address. "I think I found something the company needs, but if it's handled wrong, it won't hold up." Aiden arrived at the office before 7 the next morning. He did not go up to the executive floor. He waited near the second-level offices and eventually found Madison Pierce coming through the lobby with a coffee carrier and the look of someone who had already had a difficult phone call before 8. He told her he believed he had email correspondence from 8 years ago that could be relevant to the lawsuit. She asked where the email was stored. He said it was on a personal archive drive from a previous employer, never connected to a North Star system, unaltered since the original export. Her expression did not reassure him. She said that introducing personal documentation into an active lawsuit, without the right chain of custody, could create more problems than it solved. Evelyn Hart was called in. She reviewed what Aiden had described with the focused attention of someone building an inventory. She told him clearly that nothing could be moved, renamed, shared digitally, printed, or discussed with outside counsel until the evidence had been properly isolated and preserved. She explained why, in terms that assumed he could follow the reasoning, which he appreciated. He agreed to every condition she outlined. Mason Keller arrived while Evelyn was still in the room. He said that a junior employee trying to position himself as the company's savior, using an old email he kept on a personal hard drive, was not a legal strategy, it was a distraction. He said people in Aiden's position rarely understood how litigation at this scale worked. He said the company had retained outside counsel that billed $500 an hour, and perhaps Aiden should trust those people instead of playing detective. Sophia had come with Aiden that morning because her school was closed for a staff development day. She had been sitting on a bench in the lobby hallway with her backpack in her lap, patient in the way that children who have learned not to ask too many questions can be. She was too far away to hear most of what was said, but she could see Mason pointing at her father. She saw her father stand still and say nothing. Aiden said, "I do not need anyone to believe me. I only need people to examine the data properly." It was the kind of statement that carried weight precisely because of how little it asked for. Violet appeared at the end of the hallway just as the tension peaked. She issued 3 instructions without drama. Evelyn would lead an evidence preservation process. Lucas would provide technical verification support, and Aiden would have 30 minutes to present his findings to the internal legal team. Mason said 30 minutes was time the company could not afford. Violet replied that $300 million made 30 minutes a reasonable investment. In the elevator on the way down, Sophia took Aiden's hand. She asked quietly whether he had done something wrong. He looked down at her and said no. He said that sometimes telling the truth required waiting for the right moment, and that the waiting was always the hardest part. The data examination room on the 3rd floor was nothing like the executive conference room above it. There were no views of the street, no branded water bottles, no framed mission statements on the walls. There were 2 metal desks, a bank of monitors, a portable hard drive enclosure, and a whiteboard covered in notation from a previous project that no one had erased. Aiden sat in a chair that was slightly too low for the desk and set his drive on the table in front of a man he had not met before. Connor Hayes was a digital forensics contractor Evelyn had brought in on a rush basis. He was methodical, unsmiling, and thorough. Connor asked for the complete drive, not just the email. He wanted the file system, creation dates, directory structure, and email header strings. Aiden walked him through the history without embellishment. His role at Clearwell, the nature of the North Star contract, and the handover process that had generated the export. The examination took most of the morning. Connor identified several pieces of metadata that remained intact. Original creation timestamps, mail server header chains, sender and recipient addresses, the digital signature fields that some mail systems used in that era. Certain portions of the data needed additional verification against external server records, but the core material was in far better condition than anyone had anticipated. Evelyn began changing her posture. She was not yet certain, but she was no longer treating this as a distraction. Lucas Grant had been called in to review the technical content of the attachments. When he read through the attached draft document, he went quiet for several seconds. The terminology was remarkably close to the architecture that North Star's current product used, not identical, but the conceptual vocabulary was the same. Lucas knew what that meant. He also knew that during a major system migration 5 years earlier, large portions of the early development record had been moved to archive storage and never indexed. No one had deleted the data on purpose. No one had preserved it on purpose either. Evelyn outlined what the evidence still needed to become legally useful. A single email, even with intact metadata, was not enough by itself. She asked Aiden whether he could recall anyone from the North Star side of that project who might still be reachable. He thought for a moment and gave her a name. Caleb Morgan, formerly a product manager at North Star, who had left the company several years after the project was shelved and had since moved out of the industry entirely. Caleb had been on the email thread. He had been in the room when the idea was first presented to the product team. Mason arrived during the summary portion of the session. He looked at the drive on the table, looked at Aiden, and asked whether the company was seriously prepared to stake its defense on an archive maintained by a man who was still using an 8-year-old laptop because he could not afford a new one. Aiden did not raise his voice. He said that the condition of his personal equipment had nothing to do with the integrity of the data on the drive, and that he would prefer if Mason left his financial situation out of a conversation about evidence. Violet, who had been standing near the door, heard both statements. She did not react visibly, but something in her expression shifted slightly, the way a reading changes when you add one more variable to an equation. Evelyn gave the team 24 hours. If corroborating evidence could be located and verified within that window, the email archive could form the foundation of a credible defense. By midday, the outside world had gotten louder. Brightline held a press conference at a glass building in Chicago, where their lead attorney stood in front of a corporate logo and described North Star Logic as a company that had built its success by appropriating the intellectual work of its competitors. They presented a curated timeline, a selection of photographs from their product development history, and several emails, some legitimately obtained, some of uncertain origin, that were designed to make North Star look reactive and derivative. The presentation was polished. The narrative was simple. Simple narratives, in Aiden's experience, always traveled faster than complicated ones. The effect inside North Star was immediate. A major client paused their renewal contract. The stock price continued its decline. In the corridors, employees spoke in the low tones of people speculating about their own futures. The atmosphere of a company that believed in itself had given way to the atmosphere of one that was no longer sure. Mason moved quickly in the resulting climate. He had already drafted a proposed settlement framework, a financial concession to Brightline, a corporate acknowledgement of procedural failures, and a restructuring of the technical leadership team to demonstrate accountability. Included in the restructuring was Aiden's name. The language used to justify his removal cited gaps in his employment record and his proximity to the legacy data systems. It was constructed for maximum defensibility and minimum honesty. Violet told Mason she would not remove someone from the company who might be holding the only documentation that could reframe the entire case. Mason replied that placing the company's survival in the hands of a man who had been hired out of sympathy was a risk no board could rationally accept. The word sympathy landed in the room and stayed there. Aiden did not hear that exchange. He was working in a storage annex on the second floor, a room with an industrial carpet and 2 filing cabinets that smelled like the 90s, eating a sandwich from the cafe downstairs and reviewing the archive with the methodical care that had defined his work style since he was 22. He took a call from Sophia at 3:15 because she had a question about a homework assignment. He told her to start with what she already knew, figure out what was missing, and work from there. He did not realize until he hung up that he had just described his own afternoon. Sophia mentioned that a classmate had said her father's company was in the news for stealing. Aiden told her that the truth did not become weaker just because someone else was talking over it. Shortly after he ended the call, Aiden found a second email thread nested within a subfolder he had almost missed. This one was more detailed than the first. It contained a back and forth between two of Northstar's original engineers discussing the mathematical structure of the memory layer, how the system would weight incidents by recency, how it would assign severity scores by root segment, how it would generate risk predictions from accumulated failure history. The language in that exchange matched the core algorithm of the current Northstar system in a way that was no longer ambiguous. He reached for his phone to contact Evelyn. Before he could dial, the screen on his company-issued workstation went gray. A message informed him that his access had been suspended pending an internal security review. Mason had moved faster than he had expected. Aiden sat for a moment in the quiet of the annex, looking at the locked screen. He pulled a small notebook from his bag and wrote down 3 names he needed to reach before anything else happened. Caleb Morgan lived in a town called Millhaven, in the eastern part of Ohio, where the roads narrowed and the houses had enough yard to make the silence feel intentional. He had left the technology industry without much ceremony and now ran a small independent advisory practice that mostly helped regional manufacturers with operational planning. He answered his personal phone on the 3rd ring. In the middle of what sounded like a long walk, Aiden told him who he was and why he was calling. There was a pause on the other end that lasted long enough for Aiden to wonder if the call had dropped. Caleb said he was not interested in being pulled into a lawsuit on behalf of a company that had shelved the project, restructured the team, moved everyone on, and now wanted to use the past for protection, without ever acknowledging what the past had actually been. He said it with the specific tiredness of someone who had been disappointed slowly rather than all at once. Aiden did not try to argue him into anything. He said that if Northstar lost on the basis of an accusation that was factually wrong on the basis of being called a thief for something they had actually developed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with the early history would lose their jobs. He said that if the record was buried a second time, the engineers and support staff and contractors who had been part of that first iteration would be written out of their own story permanently. Caleb was quiet again. Then he asked what exactly Aiden had found. Under the parameters Evelyn had established, Aiden described the email in general terms. The subject line, the approximate date, the category of content. Caleb recognized it immediately. He remembered that particular exchange and the session where the idea had been presented to the broader team. And then he said something Aiden had not anticipated. He remembered Aiden being the person who had suggested adding failure codes by root segment, and that a note to that effect had been written into one of the project documents. Aiden sat with that for a long moment. It was a small thing in the context of the lawsuit. It was not a small thing in the context of the past 8 years. Caleb agreed to sign a formal witness statement if Evelyn contacted him properly. He also mentioned that he had retained what he believed was a presentation deck used to pitch the root memory layer concept to senior leadership at Northstar. It might still be in a box in his garage. That same afternoon, Lucas Grant let himself into the storage annex. He told Aiden he should have said something when Mason called him a charity hire and that he had been afraid of the attention. Aiden said simply that silence from someone who knew better was its own kind of harm, and that the next time Lucas found himself in a room where someone was being diminished, he should speak sooner. Lucas nodded and mentioned a secondary archive server that had been decommissioned during the platform migration 5 years earlier. It had never been wiped. The equipment was still in the building's sub-basement, powered off, technically accessible. That evening, while Aiden was still working, Sophia sent him a photograph from home. It was a drawing she had made at the kitchen table, stick figures and stars, and in her careful 7-year-old handwriting across the top, the words "Dad remembers things." Aiden looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he propped his phone against the side of his notebook so the drawing stayed visible while he worked. At 11:47 that night, his personal phone received a picture message from Caleb Morgan. It was a photograph of a cardboard box sitting on a concrete garage floor. The label on the side read, "Northstar Root Memory 8 years ago." Mason called an emergency board session the following morning. which was the last of the 24-hour window Evelyn had established. He framed it as a matter of fiduciary responsibility. He said Violet had allowed an unvetted employee with a suspended access account to steer the company's legal strategy for nearly 2 days, and that the board owed the shareholders a more disciplined response than that. The conference room on the 14th floor had the same cold quality it always did. Sophia was in the waiting area outside with the woman who helped Aiden with childcare on short-notice days. She had a book and a carton of apple juice and the patience of a child who had learned that her father's work sometimes required waiting. Mason presented the settlement framework, describing it as a pragmatic response to a situation that had been allowed to become emotional. He avoided using Aiden's name directly, but structured his argument so that every part of it reflected on the decision to rely on Aiden's archive. He used the phrase non-standard personnel in a way that left no ambiguity about what he meant. Evelyn interrupted him with a preliminary assessment. She said the archive material showed strong indicators of authenticity. She said the second email thread, which she had managed to have Connor review before Aiden's access was cut, contained technical content that aligned precisely with the disputed system architecture. She said she had made contact with Caleb Morgan through a legal intermediary, and that he was prepared to provide a formal declaration. She said the decommissioned server in the sub-basement had been located and that a retrieval process was underway. Mason's response was to shift focus. He asked Aiden directly whether he understood the risk he was creating for the company if the evidence failed at the verification stage. Aiden said he understood it completely. Mason asked whether Aiden was using the lawsuit to give himself leverage over his employment situation. Aiden replied calmly that his employment was not worth $300 million. But the truth was, and he would prefer to keep those two things separate. The room was quiet after that for several seconds. Then the door to the waiting area opened slightly, and Sophia's voice came through it, soft but clear enough to carry. She said she was sorry to interrupt, but she needed to tell the people in the room that her dad did not lie. No one laughed. 1 or 2 board members looked at the table. Mason's expression went through several changes very quickly. Violet looked at Sophia and then at Aiden and made a decision. She said Aiden's access would be restored immediately, and he would work directly with Evelyn, Connor, and Lucas as part of a formal verification team. If no additional corroborating evidence appeared within 24 hours, she would reconsider the settlement option. Until that window closed, the process would run. Mason gathered his papers and left. The sub-basement of the North Star building was not a place that appeared in any company photographs. It was a utilities corridor, bare concrete, exposed piping, industrial lighting that buzzed faintly and turned everyone's face the same pale yellow-gray. At the far end, behind a steel cage that required a facilities key, sat a row of decommissioned servers. They had been disconnected from the building's network during the migration 5 years earlier and left there in the manner of things that no one had decided to throw away but also had no further use for. Connor approached the equipment with the seriousness of someone who understood that the way you touched a thing could determine whether it survived the touching. He had brought his own tools and his own chain of custody protocol. Lucas called out hardware identifiers as Connor logged them. Evelyn stood near the door. Aiden stood with his hands in his pockets and waited. The first image attempt failed. The drives were old and one sector had developed a read error. Connor spent 40 minutes working around it. While he worked, the group said very little. Mason sent a message to Violet's phone. The board expects a final decision before the markets open. Violet did not respond. Aiden, watching the progress bar move across Connor's portable workstation screen, tried to recall the naming conventions that the Clearwell North Star project had used. Product managers in those days had a habit of labeling things imprecisely, using internal shorthand that made perfect sense in context and no sense years later. He told Connor that the relevant materials had been filed under a project name that was different from the one the technology eventually carried. The product team had called it Incident Recall Layer, not Predictive Routing Memory. That name had never made it into the company's later documentation. Connor ran the search against the recovered partition. The results came back within seconds. A file cluster in a directory labeled IR Layer, nested inside a Support Archive subfolder that had survived the migration. Inside it were technical support tickets, interface screenshots from an early prototype, version logs with time-stamped entries, and a project summary document. The creation date predated Brightline's first registered documentation by 14 months. Lucas exhaled slowly and audibly. Connor began working through the verification process without comment. Aiden stood in the buzzing yellow light and allowed himself the specific quiet of a moment that had taken 8 years to arrive. There was still more to find. Connor examined the old server's access log and identified a consulting account that had downloaded a summary document shortly after the route memory project was shelved. The same account holder had, within the following 18 months, appeared in Brightline's employment records as an outside technical advisor. Connor flagged this carefully. It did not prove that Brightline had obtained the information through that relationship, but it dismantled the foundational claim that Northstar had developed its technology after Brightline's work was already public. Evelyn stated aloud that this materially changed the posture of the litigation. They were no longer defending a gap in the timeline. They were presenting a timeline of their own. Caleb's scan arrived at 4:17 in the morning. The deck was 41 slides, lightly formatted. Slide 7 contained a diagram of the root memory layer architecture. The footer of every slide carried the Northstar logic name and the date from 8 years prior. The metadata was clean. In the notes field of slide 11 was a single line. Aiden Brooks suggested failure. Code retention by root segment flagging for integration consideration. Lucas saw his own name in the acknowledgement section, 2 lines below Aiden's. He had not remembered being listed. He said nothing that was adequate, which Aiden understood. Connor laid the pieces out in sequence. The original email, the incident recall layer file cluster, the support tickets, the deck, the access log, and Caleb's declaration. He told Evelyn that individually, each element was significant. Together, they formed a documented and corroborated timeline that placed Northstar's conceptual development of the disputed technology well before Brightline's filing record. Evelyn looked across the table at Violet, who had been present since midnight. She said, "If this holds up under scrutiny, and I believe it will, we are not defending anymore. We are presenting the truth." Violet called the board together for the last time before the evidence package was handed to outside counsel. Mason did not dispute the authenticity of the evidence that ground had been taken from him. Instead, he attacked the reliability of the person who had found it. He cataloged Aiden's employment history aloud, the gaps between positions, the small contracts, the absence of management credentials. He said the board had a responsibility to consider whether the company's fate should rest on a single individual operating outside the standard documentation system. It was, Violet recognized, the only argument he had left. Aiden stood at the side of the room in front of a monitor displaying the assembled timeline. He walked through it methodically. The original email predating Brightline's filings by nearly a year, the incident recall layer file cluster, the support tickets, the presentation deck with its time-stamped metadata, the external access log, and Caleb's formal declaration. He did not editorialize. He let the dates and the content carry the argument the way evidence is supposed to, without needing a narrator. When Mason asked him directly why someone with his professional history had not advanced further in the industry if he was as capable as the evidence suggested, the room went very quiet. Aiden answered without looking away. He said that for 8 years he had made choices that protected his daughter's mornings and pickups and sick days, and that those choices had come at a professional cost he had understood and accepted. He had taken smaller assignments, turned down opportunities that required travel, and structured his work life around a 7-year-old who had one parent and deserved to see that parent. He had never stopped working carefully or honestly, and the archive on his drive was the proof of that. A person could be without a senior title and still possess memory, diligence, and integrity, and those qualities did not expire because no one in power had noticed them. He added that he had not been hired out of sympathy. He had been hired because he knew what the company had looked like before it forgot its own foundations, and that was precisely the kind of knowledge the company had needed without knowing it needed it. Lucas stood up from his chair. He said, publicly and without prompting, that he had failed to support Aiden when Aiden had first raised the email archive, and that he was correcting that failure now. He said the evidence was sound, and that he would attest to it in whatever format the legal team required. Madison said that if the company wanted to reclaim public trust, the story they needed to tell was the true one, not the convenient one. Mason was outvoted. The board authorized Evelyn to proceed with the evidence package. Violet looked at Aiden as the meeting ended. She said, "Without decoration, are you ready to see this through?" Aiden glanced through the glass wall at the waiting area, where Sophia had fallen asleep in a chair with her book across her chest. He looked back at Violet and said he had started the work for the right reason and would finish it the same way. The mediation session took place in a building designed to feel neutral: pale carpet, long hallways, rooms named after rivers. Brightline's legal team arranged themselves with the confidence of people who had been told the outcome before it began. Northstar's team entered and took their seats. Violet sat at the center. Evelyn was to her right. Aiden was at the far end of the table, which was where he was most comfortable anyway. The session opened with Brightline's attorney presenting a clean, confident timeline. The dates of Brightline's filings, their product development history, and the absence of early records from Northstar's archive, all pointing to the inference that Northstar had developed its technology after Brightline had established the concept. It would have been devastating if the dates had gone unchallenged. Evelyn introduced the evidence package in 4 segments. She laid the timeline down item by item: the original email, the incident recall layer file cluster, the support tickets, the deck, the external access log. She described how each piece had been preserved and what chain of verification had been applied. Connor Hayes provided technical testimony confirming the forensic process. Caleb Morgan's signed declaration was entered affirming that the root memory layer project had existed at Northstar before the date on Brightline's earliest registered material. Brightline's attorney attempted to undermine the archive by questioning Aiden's role. He asked why a technical support contractor would retain documentation of this kind for 8 years. Aiden responded without hesitation. He said that his role at the time had specifically included the management and export of support records, and that the archive had been produced as a formal deliverable of the project handover. He said he had kept it because it was a professional record of work he had been responsible for. He had not kept it because he anticipated a lawsuit. He had kept it because he was careful with the things he was given responsibility for. The room absorbed that answer differently than the attorney had intended. When Brightline's team asked to take a recess, the mediator granted 40 minutes. Mason sat in the hallway with his arms crossed. Violet stood near a window. Aiden sat on a bench and called Sophia. She asked if he had won yet. He looked down the hallway, where Evelyn was walking back toward him with something in her expression that was not quite a smile but was moving in that direction. He told Sophia that the right people had listened to the truth today, and that sometimes that was the first kind of winning. When the mediation resumed, Brightline's attorney no longer spoke in the same register. The mediator noted formally that the documentary record raised substantial questions about the foundational premise of the complaint and that the case would require reassessment. It was not a verdict, but it was a turn. Outside the building, Madison received a notification on her phone. It was a news line. Northstar Logic presents historical documentation predating core Brightline claim. The stock ticker had paused its decline. The distribution client's account manager had sent an email requesting a call. In the parking garage afterward, Mason Keller walked past Aiden without stopping. Then he stopped. He said, with the minimum number of words possible, "I underestimated you." Aiden said that Mason had not only underestimated him, he had underestimated anyone who did not look like the kind of person Mason had decided mattered. He said it without anger. The way a person states a fact, they have carried long enough that it no longer needs force. Mason walked to his car. Aiden drove home to pick up his daughter. The weeks that followed moved slowly, and then all at once. The lawsuit was still technically in progress, the outcome still being negotiated, but the posture of those negotiations had reversed. Northstar was no longer the defendant trying to explain a gap. It was the party with a documented timeline, a corroborated history, and the moral position that came from telling the truth, when doing so, had been genuinely inconvenient. Violet held an all-hands meeting in the main conference space on the second floor. She did not share confidential legal details. She said simply that the company had nearly lost something it had every right to keep, and that the reason it had not was because one person had done the work of remembering when it would have been easier to let the record stay buried. The people who had been in the building for the past several days understood exactly who she was describing. Mason Keller resigned from the Risk Oversight Committee 10 days after the mediation session. The official communication cited a desire to reduce board commitments. The people who had watched Mason cut Aiden's system access during the active evidence search understood the fuller context, and they drew the conclusions they were entitled to draw. Lucas found Aiden in the hallway on a Wednesday afternoon and apologized more completely than he had before. He said he had thought about the moments in his career when he had watched someone being diminished and chosen comfort over correction, and the number was higher than he could be proud of. Aiden accepted the apology without reducing what it was acknowledging. He said the silence of decent people created space that unkind people were always ready to fill. Evelyn asked Aiden formally to join the working group developing a new evidence integrity system for the company. The group would be responsible for cataloging historical technical contributions, maintaining archival documentation standards, and ensuring that the early record of the company's development was properly preserved and attributed going forward. Violet offered him a formal role, director of a small team she was naming Product Memory and Evidence Integrity. The title carried a modest salary adjustment and a schedule structure that Aiden had the right to help design. Before he accepted, he asked whether the role could accommodate his need to maintain consistent hours around Sophia's school schedule. Violet said she would personally ensure the position was structured with that requirement built in from the start. Sophia came to the office on a Friday afternoon the week Aiden moved into his new workspace. Violet crouched to eye level and told Sophia that her father had helped a great number of people keep their jobs. Sophia listened, then looked at her father and nodded once, as though confirming something she had already known. Aiden packed the last of his things from the old storage annex. He picked up the photograph. Sophia had sent him the drawing with the stick figures and the words "Dad remembers things" written across the top, and carried it to his new desk. He pressed it flat against the wall beside the monitor. Not as a trophy, as a reminder of the reason the work had been worth doing. The lawsuit reached its resolution several months later, on a Thursday that was unremarkable in every way except the one way that mattered. Brightline withdrew the primary count of the complaint, the direct theft allegation, following a formal review of the timeline documentation that Northstar had submitted. What remained was a narrower dispute about data access standards and contractor protocols, and that portion was resolved through a mutual agreement that involved no admission of wrongdoing by either party. Northstar did not have to surrender its technology, did not face financial penalties, and did not lose its major client contracts. The company kept its people. Aiden's team spent the following quarter building what Violet had described as a memory infrastructure. They cataloged the company's technical history from its earliest recoverable period, created a formal attribution system for contributions that had previously gone unrecorded, and established protocols that made it structurally difficult for early documentation to disappear in future migrations. The work was not glamorous. It happened in background directories and metadata fields, and it was the kind of work that everyone would benefit from without fully understanding. Aiden still arrived early and left in time for school pickup. He still brought his lunch. He still said less in meetings than most people of his seniority were expected to say. But when he did speak, people had learned to listen in a different register than they had before, because they understood that his silences were not vacancy but selection. Violet changed, too, in the way that honest reckonings tend to change people capable of having them. She introduced a contribution credit system ensuring that engineers and support staff and contractors received documented recognition for their work not in sweeping gestures, but in personnel records and project histories. She said in a leadership meeting that a company unable to account for its own foundations was not as stable as it looked, and that the stability they had nearly lost had come from the one person they had systematically undervalued. One afternoon several months after the case closed, Violet walked Aiden through the main conference room on the 14th floor. The walls had been reconfigured to display the company's actual history, not marketing material. A restoration of the project timeline ran along one wall, naming engineers, contractors, and product managers who had worked on the early platform. The entries were not large, but they were present, and legible, and permanent. On the segment covering the root memory period, among the names listed under technical contributors was Aiden Brooks. Not in the largest type, not in the most prominent position, but there and not erased. Sophia asked her father one evening, as they drove home through the ordinary dark of a weekday night, whether he was an important person now. He thought about the question the way he thought about most questions worth answering. He told her he was not certain that important was the right word for what he was. But he was certain of something else. That no one had the right to tell another person what their own story was worth. That was a decision that belonged to the person who had lived it. They stopped at the light on the corner 2 blocks from home. In his jacket pocket, folded inside an envelope, was a printed copy of the original email, stamped with the forensic verification seal, logged in the company's permanent record, no longer a forgotten file on a dusty drive, but the document that had kept hundreds of people employed and a company honest. They had called Aiden Brooks a charity hire. They had said the words in a glass room, in front of witnesses, with the absolute confidence of people who believed that a man's value could be read from his title and his salary history and the age of his laptop. They had been wrong. And the reason they had been wrong was simple. They had never asked what he remembered.